What happens when silence becomes more powerful than shouting? What happens when a man accused of fraud in front of a full airplane chooses not to argue, but to wait? On Flight 2941 in seat 2A sat Jonathan Reed, a 49-year-old black executive, dressed sharply, calm as stone. A flight attendant demanded he move. The captain hesitated. Security was called. Cameras rose. Within minutes, thousands of strangers across the internet were watching. But Jonathan wasn't just any passenger. He was holding a secret that could shake an entire airline. Every second ticking on his watch wasn't just time, it was a countdown to revelation. Could 12 minutes of silence expose decades of prejudice? Could one man sitting firmly in his seat change the entire aviation industry? And when his true identity was revealed, what would happen to those who had doubted him tonight? We tell the story of dignity tested at 30,000 feet, and how one flight turned into a courtroom in the sky. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the stories that challenge injustice and celebrate truth. Now, let's step aboard Flight 2941. The cabin lights glowed with a soft amber hue, the kind that made people sink a little deeper into their seats. It was late evening, and Flight 475 of Oceanic Air was preparing for its journey from Chicago to San Francisco. The bustle of boarding had quieted, and a low hum of conversation filled the air. The wheels had not yet left the ground, but there was already a stillness, a fragile calm before what no one yet knew would become a storm. In seat 2A of first class sat Jonathan Reed, a 48-year-old man who carried himself with quiet authority. His dark suit was cut with precision, not flashy but unmistakably tailored. A silver cufflink caught the cabin light whenever he moved, subtle reminders that he was no ordinary traveler. His wrist bore a polished watch, its steady ticking the only sound he seemed to hear. Jonathan leaned slightly toward the window, not to look outside but to carve a small boundary of peace around himself. Around him, other passengers settled in, a businessman already tugging at his laptop, a young couple whispering about wine lists, a teenager in the back row of first class scrolling with restless energy. Flight attendants moved with choreographed efficiency, pulling carts, adjusting bins, checking belts. It should have been an ordinary evening flight, but in stories that change the world, ordinary never lasts. Emily Dawson, a 34-year-old flight attendant, paused when she reached row 2. Her eyes fell on Jonathan. Something in her gaze hardened, subtle at first, almost invisible, but sharp enough that Jonathan, without turning, felt the shift in air. Emily's smile for the couple in 2C faded when she faced him. "Sir," she said with clipped politeness, "may I see your boarding pass?" Jonathan turned, his expression calm. He pulled the printed ticket from the holder and handed it over. Emily's eyes scanned quickly, then narrowed. Seat 2A. Paid, valid. She lingered longer than necessary, as if searching for something out of place. She handed it back, but her smile had disappeared entirely. Minutes later, she returned. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again." The businessman in 1C looked up, sighing audibly. The couple across the aisle exchanged a glance. Jonathan, still calm, handed over the ticket once more. His eyes did not flicker with irritation, though inside he wondered how many times dignity could be tested in the space of a few minutes. Emily studied the pass again, her voice dropping lower. "This doesn't look right. Did you perhaps switch seats? This section is reserved." Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, He turned back toward the window, his silence deliberate, almost like a mirror reflecting her words back at her. That silence unsettled Emily more than protest would have. She shifted, cleared her throat, and leaned closer. "Sir, if you don't respond, I'll need to involve the captain." Passengers were starting to notice. Phones angled upward from armrests. One teenager in row 4 raised his camera higher, sensing that something was brewing. Jonathan sat motionless, his fingers folded neatly in his lap. On his phone in his pocket, unseen by the cabin, a vibration pulsed. A message waited from his legal team. "Everything is prepared. Sir, just give the word." But Jonathan gave no word. He waited. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. The air in the cabin thickened. A baby's soft whimper broke into cries and was quickly hushed, as if even infants felt the growing tension. Emily glanced around, hoping for support. She found none. The businessman checked his watch again. Annoyed more by the delay than by the man in 2A, the couple whispered, eyes darting toward Jonathan but never meeting his gaze. Zoe Miller, a 27-year-old journalist sitting in 3B, adjusted her phone discreetly. She'd gone live on social media dozens of times before, but this moment felt different. Something inside her told her to press the red button. Her feed lit up instantly with a few hundred viewers. Within seconds, comments scrolled, "What's happening? Is that oceanic air? Get closer." Emily's tone sharpened. "You're delaying this flight. If you refuse to cooperate, the captain will be called immediately." The hum of conversation in the cabin fell silent, swallowed whole by the weight of her words. Somewhere in the rear, a passenger coughed nervously. Another shifted in their seat, the squeak of leather almost deafening in the hush. Jonathan turned then, for the first time since Emily had approached. His eyes were calm, steady, unflinching. He didn't speak. He only smiled a faint, enigmatic curve of lips that chilled Emily more than outright defiance ever could. It was not the smile of arrogance. It was not mockery. It was the smile of someone who knew the ground beneath his feet would soon shift, and not in the way others expected. Emily felt a tremor run through her. Her hand clenched the boarding list tighter, crumpling the corner. She turned on her heel and strode down the aisle, each step echoing louder than the last in the tense quiet. Her voice carried into the intercom phone at the galley. "Captain Klein, we need you in first class immediately." The intercom blared, harsh and metallic, like an alarm siren. Passengers flinched. The soft calm of the cabin shattered. All eyes shifted forward. Phones tilted higher. The moment was no longer a private exchange. It had become a performance under 100 watchful eyes, and more through the lens of Zoe's phone. Her live stream count ticked upward, 800. Then 1,000. Jonathan didn't move. He sat as still as stone, the hum of the engines beneath him a faint vibration. His watch glinting under the cabin lights.
We need to ensure all our assets
to everyone
are secure
else,
before we land.
He was now
Understood.
the man at the center of conflict.
I've already put the preliminary measures
To
in
himself, he was still waiting. The test had only begun, far away in the cockpit. Captain Robert Klein adjusted his headset. The call from Emily made his stomach tighten. He had flown for more than 25 years. Passenger conflicts were routine, but the urgency in Emily's voice unsettled him. Heavy steps echoed as he left the cockpit, his polished shoes striking like a drumbeat as he approached first class. Passengers leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. The storm was about to break. Captain Robert Klein's stride down the narrow aisle was deliberate, heavy enough that passengers felt the vibration through the floorboards. His uniform jacket was sharp, his shoulders marked by 4 golden stripes that glinted beneath the dim cabin lights. For many, the arrival of a captain meant resolution. To Jonathan Reed, it meant the real test was beginning. Robert stopped at row 2. His gaze swept the cabin, then landed on Emily Dawson. Her face was tense, her cheeks flushed. She pointed quickly toward Jonathan, her voice firm but straining. "Captain, this passenger is occupying seat 2A without proper authorization. He refuses to comply when asked to show valid documents. He has delayed the flight and is becoming aggressive." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Passengers stirred. A man in 1C shook his head quietly. The couple in 2C pressed closer together, phones lifted higher, their small red lights recording every breath, every syllable. Zoe Miller's live stream jumped to more than 3,000 viewers. Comments streamed across her screen. "He doesn't look aggressive at all. Is she serious? This smells like discrimination." Captain Klein bent down, crouching so his eyes were level with Jonathan's. His voice carried a practiced calm, the tone of a man who had settled hundreds of disputes. "Sir, may I please see your boarding pass?" Jonathan did not speak immediately. He unfolded his hand slowly, pulling the ticket from the inside of his jacket. He handed it over with quiet dignity. Robert scanned the paper. Oceanic Air Flight 475. First class, seat 2A. Everything in order. The name read Jonathan Reed. The printing, the codes, the timestamps were all legitimate. Robert's brow furrowed. He turned the paper over once more, almost as if expecting a flaw to appear if he stared long enough. "It looks valid," he admitted, though hesitation weighted his tone. Emily interjected quickly, her voice louder than necessary. "Captain, I have seen hundreds of boarding passes. This one feels off. I know who belongs in first class, and he doesn't." Her words struck like shards of ice. Gasps scattered through the rows. Some passengers lowered their phones for just a second, glancing at one another in disbelief. Others raised them higher, capturing her statement word for word. Jonathan's head lifted. His voice was quiet, steady, but it carried through the cabin with crystal clarity. "Someone like me." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Emily folded her arms as though bracing for impact. Zoe's audience count surged past 6,000. Her chat erupted. Did she really say that this is blatant racism? "Keep recording." "Zoe," Emily pressed on, "that ticket could have been bought second-hand. Captain, maybe online, maybe through connections. These seats are for legitimate customers." Her words carried the weight of judgment, not fact. Passengers shifted in their seats. The businessman in 1C muttered under his breath, but the microphone of Zoe's phone caught fragments. "This is ridiculous." Jonathan glanced down at his watch. 12 minutes had already passed. 12 minutes of silence. 12 minutes of patience. His lips pressed together, then parted as he finally spoke again, his tone as deliberate as the ticking of the second hand. "Captain Klein, before you decide, do you know what Section 91.11 of federal aviation law actually states?" Robert stiffened. He had read those regulations dozens of times, but to hear them quoted so precisely in the cabin startled him. Emily blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Around them, passengers tilted phones to capture every detail. Zoe's feed jumped to 10,000 viewers. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his posture composed, his eyes unwavering. The law is clear. No crew member may interfere with a passenger who is not disruptive, not threatening, and not violating safety procedures. I am seated in the place I paid for. I am silent. I am calm. And yet, here we are. The air thickened further. A child in row 5 whispered, "Daddy, what's happening?" Her father hushed her quickly. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, a dull roar beneath the tense silence. Suddenly, the intercom cracked again. The female first officer's voice carried from the cockpit. "Ground security, prepare to assist with a disruptive passenger in first class." The words ignited sparks through the cabin. People shifted, muttered, raised phones higher. Zoe's comments exploded. "He's not disruptive, they're lying. This is about to blow up online." Jonathan did not flinch. He adjusted his cuff, glanced again at his watch. The second hand ticked forward with unyielding precision. 4 minutes later, the cabin shuddered as the forward door opened. 2 security officers entered. Their steps were heavy, deliberate, echoing like hammers on steel. Janet Brooks, a 41-year-old officer with sharp eyes, led the way. At her side walked Michael Torres, broad-shouldered, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. They paused at the entrance to first class, scanning the scene with quick calculation. "What's the situation?" Janet demanded. Emily's hand shot out, finger aimed at Jonathan. "This man took a first-class seat, refused to provide valid documents, and has been threatening staff." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Zoe's camera zoomed in on Jonathan, who remained still, his hands folded once more in his lap, his gaze calm but cutting. Janet stepped forward, her presence firm. "Sir, we request that you leave this seat voluntarily. If not, we will be forced to restrain you." Jonathan's head turned, his eyes meeting hers. His voice was low, deliberate, resonant. "I am sitting in the seat I purchased. I hold a valid ticket. I am not disruptive. I will not leave." Michael Torres shifted, his hand resting on the plastic restraints at his belt. Tension gripped the cabin like a storm cloud. Passengers whispered fiercely. Some prayed under their breath. Others muttered warnings. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. His voice carried, steady as a blade cutting through air. "Before you lay a hand on me, remember this. Wrongfully detaining or removing a passenger with a valid ticket can constitute unlawful detention. Are you prepared to bear personal legal liability?" The words struck harder than fists. Janet froze. Michael's grip on the restraints faltered. Murmurs swept the cabin. Zoe's stream surged past 15,000 viewers. She whispered into her phone, her voice trembling. "He knows the law. He's not just anyone." Captain Klein's pulse raced. Sweat dampened the back of his neck. For 25 years he had managed emergencies, turbulence, near collisions. Yet nothing had shaken him like this moment. He reached instinctively for his phone, and before he could unlock it, it buzzed violently. A message from operations headquarters flashed across the screen. "Social media is exploding. Handle with extreme caution." Jonathan leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. His smile was faint but carried the weight of certainty. "Take the call, Captain. It will change your career." Robert's phone vibrated again. The name on the screen made his knees weaken. Thomas Grant, Chief Executive Officer of Oceanic Air. Gasps spread across the cabin. Zoe's stream climbed past 20,000 viewers. Comments poured in like floodwaters. The CEO. "This is huge. Don't hang up. This is about to make history." Robert hesitated, then answered, his voice trembling. "Yes, sir. I'm here." Every passenger in the cabin leaned forward, every phone tilted higher. The storm had broken, and the world was watching. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Captain Robert Klein raised the phone to his ear. His hand trembled, his mouth dry, his heartbeat echoing louder than the engines. All eyes locked on him. The live stream from Zoe Miller's phone had surpassed 25,000 viewers. The comments flooded faster than she could even glance at them. On the other end of the line, a voice boomed, low and steady. "Captain Klein, this is Thomas Grant. I need a full account of the passenger situation in first class right now." Robert's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, glancing once more at Jonathan Reed, who remained perfectly still in seat 2A. His hands folded calmly, his expression unreadable. He felt as if he were staring not at a passenger but at the fulcrum of something much larger than a flight delay. "Sir," Robert stammered, "we have a passenger accused of occupying a first-class seat fraudulently."
"The honor is all mine, Captain."
Flight attendant Emily Dawson reported that his boarding pass may be invalid and that he refused to comply with instructions. The silence on the other end was heavy, broken only by the faint sound of typing, voices in the background, the unmistakable hum of a control room in crisis. Then Thomas Grant's voice returned, sharper now. "What is the passenger's name?" Robert hesitated. His tongue felt heavy. "Jonathan Reed." For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. Then, through the speaker, came a sound Robert had not expected, a harsh intake of breath, followed by clipped words. "You're telling me
we need
that
to
you
ensure
attempted
all
to
our
remove
assets are
Jonathan
secure before
Reed
we
from
land."
his seat."
Understood.
Robert's knees
I've already
nearly
put the
buckled.
preliminary measures in
He
place.
could feel the eyes of every passenger burning into him, the lenses of dozens of phones capturing every twitch of his face. He forced himself to speak. "Yes, sir, that was the report from my crew." Another pause. This one stretched long enough that the tension became unbearable. Finally, Thomas Grant's voice thundered through the receiver. "Captain, do not under any circumstances touch Mr. Reed. Do not remove him. Do not question him further. Do not escalate this incident. Effective immediately. All authority over this matter is taken out of your hands." The words hit like a hammer. Robert's face went pale. Emily's hand fell limply to her side, her fingers trembling. Michael Torres shifted uncomfortably, lowering the restraints in his hand. Janet Brooks straightened, her eyes narrowing as she looked again at Jonathan, suddenly understanding. Zoe Miller's live stream exploded. 35,000 viewers. 40. Comments surged across the screen. Who is Jonathan Reed? Why is the CEO panicking? This man has power. Jonathan adjusted his watch with deliberate calm, the polished face catching the cabin light. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, yet carried to the farthest row. "I told you this was not an ordinary incident. This is a test, and unfortunately, you have all failed." Gasps rippled through the rows. Emily's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She sank into the jump seat, her face ghostly pale, her mind racing. She thought of her small daughter at home, thought of how quickly one reckless judgment might shatter everything. Robert still held the phone, his palm slick with sweat. "Mr. Grant," he said shakily, "what are your instructions?" The answer was curt, unmistakable. "Stay where you are. Legal and operations are monitoring this live. I will be addressing Mr. Reed directly when you land. Until then, no one touches him." The call ended. Robert lowered the phone slowly, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He could feel the judgment of the cabin, the cameras, the world. He turned toward Jonathan, but Jonathan's gaze was already fixed on Emily Dawson. The silence stretched until Emily could no longer bear it. She blurted, her voice cracking, You set this up, didn't you? You planned all of this." Jonathan did not flinch. He did not blink. His reply was measured, almost gentle, yet unrelenting. "The truth does not need planning. Emily, it only needs to be revealed." Passengers stirred, their murmurs weaving into a chorus. The man in 1C muttered loudly enough for several to hear. "This isn't just about a seat anymore. This is about who runs this airline." Zoe angled her phone closer to Jonathan, whispering into her mic. "Everyone, we are watching something historic. This man isn't just a passenger. He's someone the CEO himself respects. Who exactly is Jonathan Reed?" The viewer count passed 50,000. Jonathan reached into the slim leather case beside him. The tension surged again as Michael instinctively stiffened, his hand brushing the taser on his belt. But Jonathan only pulled out a polished business card holder. He withdrew a single card and extended it toward Janet Brooks. "You should read this before taking another step," he said quietly. Janet hesitated, then accepted the card. Her eyes scanned the embossed letters. The blood drained from her face. Her hand shook as she passed it to Michael. He read it, blinked, then read it again as though he could not trust his own eyes. Robert's voice cracked. "What does it say?" Janet's lips parted, her words slow, heavy. "Jonathan Reed, chairman of the board, Oceanic Air." The cabin erupted like thunder, gasps, exclamations, the rapid clicking of phone cameras, a rising chorus of disbelief. Zoe's live stream hit 65,000. The chat exploded. "The chairman is on this flight. They tried to kick him out. This is career suicide." Emily staggered backward, her knees buckling. No, that's impossible. The chairman would never fly with us like this. He would never sit among regular passengers. Jonathan's gaze was cold now, a glint of steel in his eyes. The thing about truth, Emily, is that it does not need belief to exist. The murmurs swelled. Zoe's voice trembled with adrenaline. "He really is the chairman. This is the biggest reveal I've ever seen on a plane." At that moment, the intercom chimed again. The voice of Linda Perez, Senior Vice President of Operations, carried into the cabin. "All action against Mr. Reed ends immediately. He is not only a passenger, but the direct superior of everyone involved in this incident." The weight of those words pressed down on everyone. Robert nearly collapsed where he stood. Emily clutched the seat back for support, her face ashen. Janet and Michael dropped their restraints and straightened, their expressions transformed into reluctant respect. Jonathan leaned back slightly, adjusting his cuff. For the first time, his voice carried a trace of authority sharp enough to slice through steel. Finally, someone said it, but too late. Zoe's audience passed 75,000. The cabin itself buzzed with disbelief, awe, and a growing realization that they were witnessing a moment far larger than themselves. Emily's mascara streaked down her face as she whispered, almost to herself, "I was just doing my job." Jonathan's gaze cut through her like glass. His tone was low, deliberate. "No, you weren't doing your job. You were doing what your prejudice told you was right. And now the world is watching." The sound of quiet sobs filled the cabin. Robert pressed a hand against the wall for balance, his mind drifting to his biracial son. He felt the sting of shame burn in his chest. If his boy one day sat in first class and was treated as Jonathan had been, what would he feel? Jonathan exhaled slowly, his voice softening but no less commanding. This is not about revenge. It is about accountability. Every assumption made tonight, every insult spoken, every threat whispered, will now become evidence, and from this moment, oceanic air will never be the same. The cabin shivered with tension, yet also with something else: recognition. For the passengers, for the tens of thousands watching online. The man in seat 2A was no longer just Jonathan Reed. He was the embodiment of every wronged traveler, every silent humiliation, every quiet endurance finally brought into light. And as Zoe's live stream surged past 80,000 viewers, the same question pulsed in every heart, rising louder than the roar of the engines. Who exactly is Jonathan Reed, and what will he do next? The air in first class had shifted. Just minutes before, Jonathan Reed had been treated as an intruder, a man accused of fraud, a supposed threat. Now he sat unmoved in seat 2A, not just a passenger, but revealed as the chairman of Oceanic Air itself. His calm presence filled the cabin like a storm cloud about to break. Zoe Miller's live stream had soared past 90,000 viewers. The chat scrolled so fast it blurred into a wall of outrage and fascination. Words like historic, racism exposed, and power revealed flashed across her screen. She whispered to her audience, her voice trembling, "Everyone, we are witnessing a tribunal in the sky. This is no longer a delay. This is history unfolding 30,000 feet above the ground." Jonathan's eyes swept the cabin. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Each word carried the weight of inevitability. You all witnessed what happened here. A ticket doubted. A man judged not by his boarding pass, but by the color of his skin. That is not a mistake. That is a system at work. And tonight, this flight becomes the evidence. Emily Dawson pressed her hands to her face, her body trembling. Her tears streaked her cheeks, mascara blurring into dark rivers. She wanted to vanish, to rewind time, to erase the moment her voice had cut the air with the phrase, "someone like you." But there was no undoing it. Every passenger had heard her. Every camera had captured her. Captain Robert Klein stood frozen near the aisle, his throat dry, his hands trembling. His career, built on 2 decades of calm command, felt like it was crumbling in his grip. He glanced at Jonathan, then at Emily, and finally at the dozens of phones still raised like silent witnesses. The pressure was unbearable. He thought of his son, of the boy's light brown skin, of the years ahead. If his son faced the same humiliation Jonathan had endured, would he forgive his father for standing silent now? Jonathan's gaze shifted toward the officers. Janet Brooks met his eyes and felt a strange clarity. This was not the language of a manipulator or a fraud. This was the authority of a man who had been tested his entire life and had learned how to bend power into justice. She slowly straightened, lowering her radio, and gave a subtle nod. She would not escalate further. Michael Torres, still gripping the restraints, hesitated, his cold demeanor
faltered. It's been an honor, sir.
For the first time that night,
The honor
felt
is
doubt
all mine,
seep
Captain.
into his bones. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on his knees. His voice was low, steady, and sharp. "I will not ask you to apologize out of fear. I will ask you to speak the truth. Tell this cabin, tell the world, what you assumed when you looked at me." The words fell like a gavel striking wood. All eyes turned to Emily. Her lips trembled. The silence stretched unbearably until Zoe's audience began to demand it. Say it. Admit it. No more excuses. The comments filled the live stream, echoing like a chorus. Emily shook her head, her voice weak.
We need to ensure
I
all
thought
our
you
assets
didn't
are
belong
secure
here.
before we land.
I looked at you and assumed your ticket
I've already
was
put the
fake.
preliminary measures
I
in
let
place.
my prejudice guide me. A collective gasp swept through the rows. The words, raw and undeniable, burned into the cabin. Zoe nearly shouted into her phone. You heard it. A flight attendant just admitted open prejudice in front of nearly 100,000 witnesses. Jonathan nodded once, his expression calm, but his eyes fierce. The truth. That is the beginning. But apology is not enough. He turned his gaze to Captain Klein. The captain's hands tightened on the seat back before him. He wanted to resist, to defend himself, but Jonathan's steady eyes made resistance impossible. His throat ached as he spoke. I trusted her word without checking the evidence. I let assumption guide me. I failed in my duty as captain. I was wrong. Whispers rippled through the passengers. The confessions were out, spoken in front of a cabin full of witnesses and an audience that now exceeded 100,000 viewers. The air was electric with disbelief, with vindication, with a dawning sense that this was no longer just a flight. It was a reckoning. Jonathan leaned back, his voice deep, resonant. You see, prejudice does not announce itself. It hides in routine, in procedures, in quick judgments. Tonight, it revealed itself, and now the world sees it too. He reached into his leather case again, pulling out a slim folder. The passengers leaned forward, tension thick in the air. Jonathan opened the folder and lifted a sheet of paper, holding it where Zoe's camera could capture. Printed across the page were charts, figures, a pattern undeniable. In the last quarter alone, Oceanic Air recorded 42 complaints of racial discrimination. Only 3 were investigated. The rest dismissed as minor or unfounded. Tonight is not an accident. Tonight is the proof of a system that tolerates what should never be tolerated. The businessman in seat 1C muttered, his voice heavy with shock. My God, this isn't just about a seat. This is about the airline itself. Jonathan's voice sharpened. Do you know what a single incident costs? Stocks have already fallen 7% since this live stream began. That is nearly $900 million erased because one flight attendant believed her prejudice more than the truth of a ticket. Gasps filled the cabin. The figures were staggering, but undeniable. Zoe's audience soared past 120,000. Her voice trembled as she narrated. He has evidence. This isn't random. He came prepared. Emily collapsed into her seat, sobbing openly now, whispering about her daughter, about her mistake. But the sound was drowned by the storm of reality. Jonathan's eyes softened slightly as he looked at her. For a flicker of a moment, he saw himself years ago, a young man dismissed, denied, invisible, but the moment passed, and his voice cut cold again. This is not about destroying you. This is about ensuring no passenger, no child of color, ever has to endure what I did tonight. The intercom chimed once more. Linda Perez's voice came sharp and unyielding. Mr. Reed, the board is connected and watching this live. State your demands. The entire cabin froze. Passengers gasped. Zoe nearly dropped her phone, her voice breaking. The Board of Oceanic Air is watching this right now. This has become a corporate tribunal in the sky. Jonathan's eyes swept the cabin. He spoke slowly, each word heavy as stone. From this day forward, any proven act of discrimination at Oceanic Air will result in immediate termination. No excuses, no protective procedures. Second, every employee, from captain to crew, will undergo training on unconscious bias. And third, a fund of $10 million will be established for passengers harmed by discriminatory practices. Whispers swelled into exclamations. The man in 3D shook his head in disbelief. This is unprecedented. A policy change decided mid-flight. Zoe's audience surged again, 150,000 strong. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "He just forced an airline to change its policies in real time." Linda Perez's voice returned, crisp, decisive. "Consider it done. Your demands will be written and executed. You have our full commitment." The cabin erupted in gasps, then applause. Not polite clapping, but the raw sound of passengers realizing they had witnessed justice unfold before their eyes. Phones shook as passengers recorded, the footage racing across the internet at the speed of light. Jonathan Reed closed the folder and rested his hands calmly on the tray table. He did not bask in triumph. His expression was somber, steady, almost heavy. He had not come to win. He had come to teach, to carve a scar into the memory of an industry too long blind to its own prejudice. He looked at Emily and Robert, his voice softer now, but still unyielding. "You will not be hidden away, forgotten in some report. You will travel to every training center, telling this story, showing your failure, not to save your careers, but to make amends for the countless passengers treated as I was." Robert bowed his head, guilt and fear pressing into his chest. Emily wept, clutching the armrest, her body shaking. The verdict had been spoken, and it was merciful and damning all at once. The engines hummed as the plane began its descent. The city lights glittered below like 1,000 watchful eyes. Zoe whispered into her phone, tears streaking her face. "This flight will be remembered forever. This is not just news. This is a revolution." Jonathan Reed sat tall in seat 2A, calm amid the storm. He did not need to say more. The truth had already spoken louder than any voice could, and as the plane descended toward the runway, the passengers knew they would never forget this night. The engines of the Airbus hummed steady, but the atmosphere inside first class felt anything but calm. Every passenger sat rigid, their eyes trained on the man in seat 2A. Jonathan Reed had transformed a routine flight into something unimaginable, a courtroom, a board meeting, and a civil rights tribunal suspended 30,000 feet above the ground. The cabin lights dimmed for landing. The captain's voice, thin and unsteady, crackled through the intercom. "Prepare the cabin for descent." Robert Klein's words were automatic, the tone of a man who had repeated the phrase thousands of times before, yet tonight, even his familiar voice could not mask the tremor of fear. Jonathan glanced out the window. The desert lights of Phoenix glimmered far below, 1,000 pinpricks of gold stretching toward the horizon. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. For a moment, he thought of his younger self, a boy who once sat on a Greyhound bus, overhearing whispers that he did not belong even there. He had promised himself that day he would never again let silence define him. Tonight, he had kept that promise. Zoe Miller kept her phone steady, though her hands shook. Her live stream now surged past 170,000 viewers. The chat moved so quickly It looked like a river of fire across her screen. This is the most important flight in aviation history. He's rewriting the rules live. Seat 2A forever. Passengers whispered nervously as the wheels lowered with a low rumble. The man in 1C muttered under his breath, "When we touch down, all hell will break loose." His voice trembled with both dread and awe. Emily Dawson sat slumped in her jump seat near the galley. Her eyes were swollen from tears, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. She thought of her daughter, the 7-year-old who adored airplanes, who had asked her just last week if she could come to work one day and see the cabin. What would she think if she saw her mother's face live streamed to the world as the villain of a story that would outlive them all? Captain Robert Klein's hands gripped the yoke as the ground rose to meet them. Sweat slicked his brow, and his heart hammered. He had handled emergencies, engine failures, storms that threatened to tear metal apart. None had ever felt as heavy as this landing. He imagined the cameras waiting at the gate, the headlines already being written, and he wondered, with a bitter pang, whether his son would one day read about his father not as a captain, but as a man who failed to stand up for truth. The landing gear struck the runway with a heavy thud. The aircraft roared down the strip, slowing under the strain of the brakes. The passengers exhaled in relief, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Through the windows, flashes burst against the night sky. Dozens of media vans lined the terminal, their cameras trained on the taxiing jet. Helicopters circled above, their spotlights piercing the darkness. Reporters already clamored for answers, their microphones raised like spears. The jet bridge locked into place with a metallic groan. The cabin door opened, and the dry desert air of Arizona swept in, along with a deafening roar of voices. Reporters shouted over one another. Chairman Reed, was this systemic discrimination? How much will Oceanic Air lose because of this? Will you call for resignations? Passengers craned their necks, trying to see past the glare of cameras. Phones shook as travelers recorded the chaos outside. The man
The honor
in 3D
is all
muttered,
mine, Captain.
"I've never seen anything like this. It's like stepping into history." 2 federal agents boarded, their dark jackets bearing the bold letters, "Federal Investigation." The cabin fell into stunned silence. One of them, a gray-haired man with piercing eyes, stepped forward and flashed his badge. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Inspector General Daniel Torres, Department of Transportation. From this moment forward, this is a federal civil rights investigation." Gasps rippled through the passengers. Zoe nearly dropped her phone, her live-stream chat exploding in capital letters. "The feds are here."
We need to
This
ensure
just
all our assets
escalated
are
to
secure
national
before we
law.
land.
Understood.
Unbelievable.
I've already put the preliminary
Inspector
measures
Torres
in place.
scanned the cabin, his eyes narrowing at Emily and Robert before settling on Jonathan. "Mr. Reed, do you have evidence to support your case?" Jonathan reached into his leather case, pulling out a thick dossier stamped with bold letters, "The Klein-Dawson Protocol, Case Study in Institutional Bias." He placed it directly in Torres's hands. His voice was calm, resolute. "I have been preparing for this for 6 months. Everything has been documented. Tonight, you also have hundreds of witnesses and hundreds of thousands watching live." Torres flipped quickly through the first pages. Charts, statistics, transcripts, even internal reports all laid bare. His jaw tightened. He snapped the folder shut and nodded firmly. "We will make this flight the precedent case for the entire industry." Thank you, Chairman Reed. The passengers exhaled as if the weight of the moment pressed down on them all at once. Some whispered in disbelief. Others lifted their phones higher, recording every second. The realization struck them. They were not merely passengers anymore. They were witnesses to a case that would shake the aviation industry to its core. Emily trembled in her seat. Her sobs came in shallow gasps, each one louder than the last. She could already see the future unravel in her job gone, her reputation destroyed, her daughter's innocent questions cutting deeper than any punishment. She buried her face in her hands, whispering, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Captain Klein closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged with the crushing weight of shame. He thought again of his son, of the world his boy would grow up in, a world shaped by men like Jonathan Reed. He swallowed hard, knowing he had failed tonight not as a pilot but as a father. Jonathan rose slowly from seat 2A. His presence commanded silence. Cameras outside flashed like lightning, microphones reaching, passengers holding their breath. He turned once toward Emily and Robert. His voice was low, steady, unshakable. This was never just about a seat. This was about dignity. And dignity is not negotiable. Zoe's voice cracked as she whispered to her live stream audience. Now past 200,000 strong. He just turned humiliation into reform. This is the most powerful thing I've ever seen. Inspector Torres gestured to the passengers. We will require witness statements. Every one of you is part of this record now. But first, we need to hear directly from Mr. Reed. Jonathan stepped forward, his cufflinks gleaming under the cabin lights, his face calm but resolute. He spoke not just to Torres, not just to the passengers, but to the world beyond the cameras. Today is not about one man humiliated. This is about millions who have been disregarded, pushed aside, doubted, and treated as outsiders. From this day forward, Oceanic Air and every airline that dares operate in this country will be held accountable. The time for excuses is over. The time for justice is here. The cabin erupted in applause, thunderous and raw. Some passengers stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Others remained seated, too stunned to move. But all felt the same truth: they had just witnessed something far larger than themselves. As Jonathan stepped into the jet bridge, the roar of reporters and the blinding flash of cameras engulfed him. He did not flinch. He walked forward steady, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat. He was no longer just a passenger, no longer just a chairman. He was a symbol, the man in seat 2A, who turned an ordinary flight into a moment that would echo for generations. The jet bridge was heavy with silence until Jonathan Reed's footsteps carried through it like thunder. Each step echoed against the metal floor, steady, deliberate, unshaken. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts, white light exploding around him like lightning strikes. Reporters shouted, their voices blending into a wall of noise. Chairman Reed. Do you plan to sue Oceanic Air? Was this incident a setup? Do you believe this is the worst case of racial discrimination in airline history? Jonathan paused in the middle of the bridge, the cool desert air brushing against his face. He looked out through the terminal windows. Beyond the glass, dozens of news vans glowed under the floodlights. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting the story to millions across the globe. Helicopters hovered above, their rotors slicing the night. He turned back to the crowd of microphones that crowded his path. His voice was calm, carrying with clarity even against the noise. Tonight is not the story of one man humiliated. Tonight is the story of millions who have been disregarded, dismissed, and told they do not belong. The roar of voices dulled for a moment, as if even the reporters felt the weight of his words. Cameras zoomed closer. Jonathan held up the thick dossier he had given to Inspector General Torres. This is not speculation. These are 412 documented complaints of discrimination within the past quarter alone. Most ignored, most silenced. Tonight, they can no longer be silenced. The crowd rippled. Some reporters dropped their questions to type frantically into their devices. Others leaned closer, their microphones trembling in their hands. At the edge of the terminal, Zoe Miller stood among the passengers, her phone lifted high. Her live stream had surged beyond 250,000 viewers. She whispered to her audience, her voice trembling with awe, "This isn't just news. This is history. He's rewriting aviation before our eyes." Behind Jonathan, the cabin door remained open. Federal agents flanked it, keeping watch over Emily Dawson and Captain Robert Klein. Both looked hollow, stripped of the authority they once carried. Melissa's cheeks were stained with tears, her hands shaking in her lap. Robert's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched against the shame flood in his chest. Jonathan stepped forward again, and the wall of microphones followed him. "I am calling for 3 immediate reforms. First, a zero-tolerance policy. Any employee found guilty of discrimination will be terminated immediately, without exception. Second, mandatory unconscious bias training for every employee from captain to gate agent. Third, a $10 million compensation fund to support victims of discrimination within oceanic air." The reporters erupted in a storm of questions. How will this be enforced? What authority do you have to demand such changes? Will the board agree? Jonathan raised his hand, and silence fell again. His eyes swept the cameras. "I'm not making a request. I'm issuing a directive. As chairman of Oceanic Air, these reforms will begin tonight." A gasp rippled through the terminal. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. Zoe's voice cracked as she whispered into her live stream, "He just did it. He just changed the rules of the entire airline on the spot." Suddenly, Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, then lifted it for all to see. The name displayed was Thomas Grant, CEO of Oceanic Air. A collective murmur swept through the terminal. Jonathan pressed the speaker button, holding the phone to the microphones. The voice of Thomas Grant filled the terminal, commanding and direct. "Jonathan, we are monitoring this live. The board is assembled. We have seen enough. From this moment, your reforms are adopted. Zero tolerance, mandatory training, compensation fund. We will begin immediate implementation." Reporters gasped. Flashbulbs burst. Zoe nearly dropped her phone as her audience count surged again, racing past 300,000. Her chat exploded in a flood of disbelief and celebration. The CEO just surrendered. This is a revolution in real time. History is happening. Jonathan's expression did not change. His tone remained steady. "Thomas, this is not a surrender. This is accountability. Tonight is not about me. Tonight is about the people who paid for their seats and were told they did not deserve them. It is about the families humiliated in silence. It is about the systemic prejudice that has poisoned this industry for decades. And it ends here." There was a pause on the line. Then Thomas Grant's voice came again, quieter this time, heavy with something that almost resembled respect. "You're right, and the world is watching. We will cooperate with every investigation, and we will commit to the path you've laid out. Consider this the beginning of a new era for oceanic air." Jonathan ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He turned once more to the reporters, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "You've heard it directly. These reforms are not promises. They are binding decisions. Tonight, on this very flight, accountability became law." The crowd of journalists erupted in questions, but Jonathan did not stop. He stepped aside, gesturing toward Inspector General Torres, who now stood tall with the dossier in his hands. Torres's voice was steady, firm, cutting through the frenzy. "The Department of Transportation will oversee implementation. This will become the civil rights precedent for the American aviation industry. Tonight is the line in the sand. From here on, discrimination in the skies will be met with federal force." The passengers behind Zoe gasped audibly. A middle-aged man in 1C whispered to himself, "My God, this isn't just an incident. This is a federal revolution." Emily Dawson buried her face in her hands. The words of both men cut her deeper than any punishment could. She thought of her daughter again, the bright smile that once made her proud to wear her uniform. That pride was gone now, buried beneath the crushing weight of shame.
We need to ensure
Robert
all our assets
Klein
are
stood
secure
frozen,
before we land.
his mind
Understood.
flashing back to his son's
I've already
face.
put the preliminary
The
measures in
mixed-race
place.
boy who loved model airplanes. He could already see the headlines, already imagine the questions his boy would ask. He clenched his jaw, his voice caught in his throat. Jonathan turned back to them briefly, his voice quieter but sharp as glass. "You will not fade into silence. You will not vanish behind paperwork. You will stand as living lessons. For every class, every seminar, every training, you will recount what happened tonight, not to save your careers, to make amends." Emily sobbed openly. Robert bowed his head. Zoe's phone captured it all. Her audience now passed 350,000. Her voice trembled with awe. "This isn't revenge. This is reform. He's turning humiliation into accountability in real time." Jonathan faced the cameras once more. He lifted his wrist slightly, his watch gleaming under the floodlights. The ticking second hand seemed to punctuate his words. Seat 2A will not be remembered as a seat number. It will be remembered as a symbol, a reminder that dignity is not granted by appearance, but upheld by principle. And from this night on, no one will ever again decide who belongs in first class based on prejudice. The crowd erupted, reporters shouting, passengers cheering, federal agents standing guard as history was made in the terminal. The chant rose spontaneously from the passengers themselves, swelling until it filled the hall. "Seat 2A, Seat 2A." The words echoed against the glass, carried out into the night where the cameras broadcast them to the world. Jonathan stood at the center, calm and unshaken, the storm of history raging around him. The terminal was no longer just an arrival hall. It had transformed into a tribunal, lit by fluorescent lights and camera flashes. Reporters pressed closer, passengers craned their necks, and the chant of Seat 2A still echoed faintly through the space. The roar of helicopters above blended with the distant hum of airport operations. But inside this gate, the world seemed to have narrowed to one man. Jonathan Reed stood calm at the center of the chaos, while Emily Dawson and Captain Robert Klein shrank against the wall, their uniforms heavy with disgrace. Inspector General Daniel Torres lifted the thick dossier higher for the cameras. His voice rang clear. This document will not disappear into bureaucracy. Tonight it enters federal record. From this moment forward, Oceanic Air and every airline under our jurisdiction will be held accountable under civil rights law. The crowd gasped. Phones vibrated as live stream notifications poured in. Zoe Miller's voice cracked as she spoke into her camera. Did you hear that, federal record? This isn't just corporate reform. This is history being stamped into law right now. Jonathan's eyes softened slightly as he watched Torres, but inside, his mind was a storm. Months of preparation, sleepless nights, reading complaints, debates with lawyers, his own memories of humiliation, all of it had built toward this moment. And yet, a part of him trembled. Would the industry truly change? Or would it resist, hiding behind polished statements and shallow apologies? He clenched his jaw. No, not this time. A commotion stirred at the edge of the crowd. Federal agents cleared a path as a team of officials in dark suits entered, clipboards and tablets in hand. Their leader, a woman with steel-gray hair, introduced herself with a firm voice. Linda Perez, Federal Aviation Authority. She nodded toward Jonathan. Mr. Reed, we've been briefed. We will open a full-scale investigation into discriminatory practices within Oceanic Air and, if necessary, across the entire industry. Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters shoved microphones forward. Is this a takeover? Will airlines lose their licenses? What penalties will they face? Linda raised her hand. We will not speculate. What matters is accountability. Tonight, justice begins. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low but steady. Justice will mean nothing if it fades tomorrow. Too many lives, too many families have been scarred by humiliation in these aisles. This is not a PR disaster. This is a moral reckoning. For a moment, silence held the terminal. Then a passenger from the earlier flight, a man in 3D, raised his voice. He's right. My sister was thrown off a plane last year for nothing. They called it a misunderstanding. It ruined her. His voice cracked with pain. No more misunderstandings. The words spread like fire. More passengers spoke up, recounting their own stories, small indignities, glances, words dismissed as jokes, and outright discrimination. Their voices blended into a chorus that the cameras captured and broadcast. The world was not just watching Jonathan anymore. It was listening to the passengers, the witnesses, the victims. Emily Dawson buried her face in her trembling hands. Each voice stabbed deeper into her chest. She whispered to herself, I did this. I became part of this system. She thought of her daughter again, the bright-eyed girl who had once begged to wear her uniform hat. Now that hat felt like ash. Captain Robert Klein felt the weight too. He had stood at cockpits through turbulence, engine failures, near misses, but nothing had shaken him like hearing the word prejudice attached to his name. He thought of his son, mixed race, barely 12, building toy airplanes on the living room floor. If his boy ever faced what Jonathan had faced, what then? Shame pressed on Robert's chest until his knees nearly buckled. Jonathan noticed their collapse, but did not gloat. He addressed them directly, his tone calm but cutting. Your shame is not your punishment. Your punishment will be to face what you denied to become living proof. From now on, you will stand before training classes, thousands of employees telling this story, not to beg for sympathy, but to make amends. Emily sobbed harder. Robert bowed his head in silent acceptance. Linda Perez approached Jonathan, her eyes sharp. "Mr. Reed, we will need your full cooperation. Documentation, data, testimonies, everything." Jonathan lifted his leather case and handed her a second folder, equally thick. "You'll find 6 months of research, transcripts, internal emails, and ignored complaints. My team prepared for this. We knew the day would come when silence was no longer an option." Linda accepted the folder with both hands. "Then, this will be our foundation." She turned to the cameras. "Let it be clear. Tonight begins the Hayes-Dawson Protocol, named not to honor them, but to ensure no one forgets their failure. This protocol will require real-time monitoring of discrimination claims, federal oversight, and mandatory reporting to Congress." The words struck like thunder. Reporters erupted. Zoe's phone buzzed uncontrollably as her chat exploded. Hayes-Dawson Protocol. This is bigger than the airline we're watching history. Jonathan's chest tightened. For months, he had envisioned reforms, but hearing it given an official name filled him with a mix of pride and unease. Pride that the fight mattered. Unease because names carved into law came with permanence and with enemies. He exhaled slowly, his voice steady. "If this protocol ensures that no child, no parent, no human being is told they do not belong, then let my name, their names, any name be attached, but let the work be real." Applause broke out from passengers. Even some reporters, forgetting their objectivity, clapped briefly before returning to their work. A hand touched Jonathan's shoulder. Zoe Miller had pushed through the crowd, her phone still recording. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Mr. Reed, the world is watching. There are 370,000 people live right now. They want to hear what does this moment mean to you personally." Jonathan hesitated. Cameras pressed closer. For a moment, the air grew heavy. He thought of his own youth, the days when he had been told he didn't belong, the countless humiliations endured quietly. He thought of his daughter, asleep at home, who would one day read about this night in her school textbooks. His throat tightened. But he spoke, voice soft yet piercing. "It means that silence is no longer an option. It means my humiliation becomes our chance. And it means that my daughter and yours will never again be told by a stranger that they don't belong where they are." The crowd erupted in cheers. Zoe's viewers flooded her chat with messages, hearts, tears, the single word repeated thousands of times: respect. Linda Perez raised her clipboard. "Mr. Reed, we'll need to escort you to a closed hearing room to begin formal statements. But before we leave, do you have any final words to the public?" Jonathan turned to the cameras, his eyes sharp as steel. Seat 2A will no longer be remembered as a seat number. It will be remembered as a symbol that dignity cannot be denied, that justice can take flight at 30,000 feet, and that when prejudice rises, we will rise higher. The terminal shook with applause. Reporters shouted over one another. Passengers cheered, and the chant of Seat 2A
The honor
rose
is all
once
mine,
more.
Captain.
This time it was not just the passengers chanting, it was the crowd outside, carried in through the glass, joined by millions watching from their screens. Jonathan Reed stood calm, unshaken. Yet, deep inside, he felt the storm ahead. Reforms were promised, investigations launched, protocols named, but he knew systems fought back. The real battle had only just begun. as he followed Linda Perez and the federal agents toward the hearing room. Zoe's live stream caught his final glance back at Emily and Robert. His eyes did not hold contempt, only the heavy weight of responsibility. Then he disappeared behind the secured
We
doors,
need to ensure all our
leaving
assets
the
are
world
secure
buzzing,
before we land.
roaring,
Understood.
and forever changed.
I've already put the preliminary
The
measures
door
in
to the
place.
secured conference room closed with a heavy thud, cutting off the roar of cameras and chants from the terminal. Inside, the atmosphere was colder, quieter, but no less tense. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a stark glow on the long oak table that dominated the room. At one end sat Jonathan Reed, calm, hands folded on the polished surface. Across from him were representatives from the Federal Aviation Authority, Inspector General Daniel Torres and Linda Perez, their files stacked like weapons of bureaucracy. To Jonathan's left, Zoe Miller had been allowed in as an observer. Her phone confiscated, but her notepad open. She could no longer stream, but her pen scribbled furiously, recording every word. On the far side of the room sat Oceanic Air's legal team. 4 attorneys in crisp suits, eyes sharp, their expressions carved from stone. At their center was Charles Whitman, head of corporate legal, known in the industry as a ruthless defender of companies under fire. Torres spoke first, his tone measured. "This is a federal hearing. All testimony is recorded. Mr. Reed, you may begin by clarifying your role in Oceanic Air." Jonathan leaned slightly forward. His voice was calm, but it carried through the room like a quiet bell. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I am the chairman of the board of Oceanic Air, and I hold control and interest through Reed Global Investments. I'm not merely a passenger on this flight. I am responsible for the integrity of this airline." A ripple went through the room. Even the attorneys shifted slightly, though Charles kept his composure. Linda Perez adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Reed, you've presented evidence of systemic discrimination. We need you to walk us through it, clearly and thoroughly." Jonathan opened his case and pulled out a binder thick with documents. He slid it across the table toward Linda. "This contains 6 months of internal reports, 47 complaints filed by passengers of color, ranging from verbal harassment to wrongful ejection. Only 3 were properly investigated. The rest were dismissed or buried." Linda flipped through the pages. Her eyes hardened. 47 ignored. Charles cleared his throat. With respect, many of those complaints were inconclusive. Customer claims often lack sufficient evidence. Airlines cannot be expected to pursue every allegation to its bitter end. Jonathan turned his gaze on him. Calm, steady. "Evidence tonight. You had evidence. 12 passengers recorded everything Emily Dawson said. Tens of thousands watched live. And still, your crew moved to have me dragged off the plane. Do you really want to argue evidence?" Charles stiffened but said nothing. Torres gestured. "Continue." Jonathan drew a deep breath, his thoughts flashing back to the humiliation in seat 2A. The silence, the sting of being told he did not belong. He steadied himself and spoke. "This isn't about one flight. This is about a culture, a system that assumes dignity belongs to some passengers and not to others. I endured 12 minutes of silence so the system could reveal itself. And it did." Zoe scribbled furiously, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of his words pressing into the room. Linda Perez set the binder aside. "Mr. Reed, you've proposed a protocol. 0 tolerance for discrimination, mandatory unconscious bias training, and a compensation fund for victims. Are you formally submitting this tonight?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes, and I demand federal oversight to ensure enforcement. No company should be trusted to police itself when profit is weighed against dignity." Charles leaned forward, his voice sharp. "That's overreach. Airlines are private corporations. You cannot dictate terms that strip them of operational authority." Jonathan's eyes did not waver. When private corporations repeatedly fail to uphold civil rights, then yes, authority must be stripped. Profit does not excuse prejudice. Silence does not excuse abuse. For the first time, Charles faltered. He looked to his colleagues, but their eyes avoided his. Torres tapped his pen against the table. "We will review the proposal. But understand, Mr. Reed, if this becomes policy, it will set precedent not just for oceanic air, but for the entire U.S. aviation industry." "That," Jonathan said quietly, "is the point." The room fell silent. The fluorescent hum seemed louder now. Zoe swallowed hard, realizing she was witnessing not just a hearing, but a turning point that would ripple far beyond these walls. Linda Perez leaned back, studying Jonathan. "Mr. Reed, let us be frank. This will trigger resistance. Lobbyists, unions, even executives within your own airline will fight this. They will call it costly, unrealistic, heavy-handed. Are you prepared for that battle?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. Memories rose of his father being forced to the back of a bus, of his own rejection letters, of years being told he did not belong in boardrooms. He steadied himself. "I am prepared, because the cost of silence is higher. I will not allow another generation to endure what I endured in Seat 2A, or what millions endure daily in less visible ways." Zoe felt her throat tighten. She scribbled the words quickly, her hands trembling. "The cost of silence is higher." Charles slammed his folder shut. "This is theatrics. With all due respect, Mr. Reed, airlines operate on razor-thin margins. If every crew member fears termination over misinterpreted words, morale will collapse. Flights will be delayed, canceled. Do you want to ground the entire industry?" Jonathan's gaze sharpened. "I would rather ground an industry than let prejudice keep flying." The words cracked through the room like thunder. Even Torres, hardened by years of hearings, felt a shiver. Linda exhaled slowly. "We will recess. Mr. Reed, remain available. Mr. Whitman, your team may prepare counter-arguments, but understand this is no longer a closed matter. The public is watching." The attorneys gathered their papers with tight jaws. Charles muttered under his breath, but Jonathan caught it. "This isn't over." Jonathan allowed himself a faint smile. "You're right. It's only just begun." As the officials filed out, Zoe remained seated, staring at Jonathan. "You knew this would happen," she whispered. Jonathan leaned back, adjusting his cuff. "I hoped it would, but hope is dangerous. The real work begins now." He looked toward the closed door, the muffled sound of reporters still buzzing outside, in his chest. His heart was steady, but his mind wrestled with doubt. Would the system bend, or would it break him? Was he strong enough to fight both the boardroom and the courtroom? He thought of his daughter again, her laughter, her small hands clutching his sleeve before he left for this trip. For her, he would endure. For her, he would not bend. The session would resume soon, and the fight would intensify. But Jonathan Reed, the man in seat 2A, was no longer just a passenger. He was the storm itself, and the skies of the aviation industry would never be calm again. The boardroom of Oceanic Air's headquarters in Chicago was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a glittering skyline, while the polished mahogany table stretched like a runway across the room. Tonight, however, the grandeur could not mask the tension. Every seat was filled, from seasoned directors to fresh-faced vice presidents. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of impending consequence. At the head of the table sat Thomas Grant, the CEO. His face was pale, his hands folded, the lines on his forehead carved deeper by sleepless hours. To his right, Jonathan Reed took his seat, silent, calm, exuding the quiet authority that had carried him through the ordeal on Flight 2941. Everyone knew why they were here. The incident had erupted across every news outlet in America. The live stream replayed endlessly, dissected by commentators, politicians, and millions of angry citizens. Grant cleared his throat. We are here because our airline is in crisis. Our stock has fallen 12% in a single day. Lawsuits are already being drafted, regulators are circling, and above all, our passengers have lost trust. We need a path forward. Murmurs rippled around the table. The chief financial officer, Leonard Price, leaned forward. We have options. A temporary suspension for the crew, a carefully crafted apology, and a promise to review training. It won't undo the damage, but it might slow the bleeding. Jonathan turned his gaze on him, measured and sharp. That is exactly the kind of cosmetic fix that led us here. 47 complaints ignored, 3 acknowledged, and a culture of silence that allowed discrimination to fester. Do you really think a polished apology will restore trust? Price bristled. We cannot overhaul the entire system overnight. Shareholders demand stability. Shareholders, Jonathan said quietly, also demand growth, and growth will not return if the public believes Oceanic Air tolerates prejudice. Stability without integrity
It's been an honor, sir.
is failure in disguise. The words
The honor
landed
is
like
all
a blow.
mine, Captain.
Several directors shifted uncomfortably. Linda Perez, invited to represent federal oversight, sat further down the table. She raised her voice. This isn't just about public relations. The Department of Transportation will not let this go. If reforms are not implemented, Oceanic risks losing federal contracts and route privileges. This is bigger than shareholders. Grant rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. Mr. Reed, you've made your position clear: zero tolerance, mandatory training, and a compensation fund. But the board needs to hear the full implications. You're asking us to fire employees
We need to
immediately
ensure
for
all our
proven
assets are secure
discrimination.
before we land.
That
Understood.
is termination
I've
without
already
lengthy
put the
review.
preliminary measures in place.
Are you certain this is the right step? Jonathan's voice was steady. Yes, because hesitation has already cost us. Every delayed investigation, every brushed-aside complaint has now erupted into a national scandal. The only way forward is clarity. No excuses, no delays. Everyone must know that dignity is non-negotiable. Across the table, Charles Whitman, the same attorney who had sparred with Jonathan at the hearing, shifted in his seat. With respect, Chairman Reed, you are proposing a policy that will expose us to wrongful termination suits. We will drown in litigation. Jonathan leaned back, his eyes locked on Whitman. And how many lawsuits will we face if we continue as we are? How many millions will be lost in settlements when every passenger with a phone can prove discrimination in real time? The choice is not between lawsuits and peace. The choice is between controlled accountability and uncontrolled collapse. Silence pressed against the glass walls. Even those who opposed Jonathan found no easy retort. Zoe Miller, seated quietly at the edge as a press liaison, felt her pulse race. She scribbled furiously, her notes filling pages. She could sense history being written, not in chants and applause, but in the quiet fury of a boardroom forced to confront its own reflection. Grant finally spoke, his voice weary but sharp. "What about cost? The compensation fund you proposed $10 million. That is no small figure." Jonathan clasped his hands together. "It is less than what we lost today in market value, less than what we lose every time another incident surfaces. The fund is not charity. It is an investment in credibility. It tells the world we take responsibility." The room was quiet again. Then, from the far end, a younger director, Maya Chen, spoke. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words carried conviction. "I watched the live stream. I saw the moment Emily Dawson said, 'Someone like him.' And I thought of my father, who came here with nothing, who was told the same words in 100 ways. If we do not act now, if we sweep this under the rug, then I don't know why I sit at this table. Mr. Reed is right. We need change." Her words struck a chord. Heads turned. Some nodded slowly. Others frowned, torn between loyalty to the old guard and the call for reform. Jonathan allowed the silence to grow. He knew silence was powerful. It forced people to hear their own doubts. Finally, he spoke. "You have all seen the evidence. You have all watched the footage. This is not about whether you believe me. This is about whether you believe the truth your own eyes showed you. I am not asking you to gamble. I am asking you to act." Grant exhaled heavily, pushing back in his chair. "Then let us vote." The board secretary distributed slips, but the tension was already visible. Hands trembled, pens scratched paper. Minutes later, the votes were tallied. 9 in favor, 4 against, 2 abstained. The reforms passed. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, a surge of relief tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. He had won a battle, not the war. Grant looked down the table. "It is decided. Oceanic Air will adopt the Reed Protocol, effective immediately. Zero tolerance for discrimination, mandatory unconscious bias training, a $10 million compensation fund. Implementation will begin within 30 days. A murmur rippled across the room. Some directors looked resigned, others looked furious, but none could undo the decision now. Whitman slammed his folder shut. "You've set us on a dangerous path. Reed, do not think the backlash will not come." Jonathan met his glare without flinching. "It always comes. But dignity is worth the storm." Linda Perez stood, gathering her files. "I will report this outcome to Washington. Federal oversight will begin at once. This will become a national precedent." As the meeting adjourned, directors filed out in silence, some avoiding Jonathan's eyes, others offering reluctant nods of respect. Zoe remained seated, her pen frozen above the page. She felt the weight of what she had witnessed, the way history often feels quiet when it is being born. Jonathan rose slowly, adjusting his cuff. He looked out at the glittering skyline, the city lights like scattered stars. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, calm but burdened. Inside, his mind churned. He had forced the board to bend. But would the culture change? Would crew members, scattered across thousands of flights, truly see passengers differently? Or would prejudice simply retreat underground, waiting to re-emerge? He thought of his daughter again. her small voice asking if he was safe. He thought of the passengers still out there, boarding planes with quiet dread, wondering if dignity would be denied, and he thought of the word he had carried through every humiliation, every boardroom battle, every silence respect. He whispered it now, almost to himself, but Zoe heard it. Respect. She lowered her pen, her throat tight. For the first time, she felt not like a reporter, but like a witness to something far greater. Outside, the city pulsed with energy. Inside, Jonathan Reed stood alone at the head of the empty boardroom. He knew the storm was not over. In truth, it had only just begun. But for the first time, the path was clear. Morning broke with headlines screaming across every major outlet. Oceanic Air adopts zero-tolerance policy. Airline board votes in historic reforms. Chairman Reed forces change at Oceanic. Television anchors dissected every second of the viral video from Flight 2941 replaying Emily Dawson's words, "Someone like him," and Jonathan Reed's calm rebuttal. Social media burned like wildfire. The hashtag Respect in the Skies trended for the second straight day, joined now by Reed Protocol and Justice at 30,000 feet. But as the public applauded, not everyone was ready to embrace the change. In a union hall near Dallas, dozens of flight attendants gathered in a hastily called meeting. The room buzzed with tension. Some were furious, others nervous, all unsettled. At the front, Union President Karen Lopez raised her voice over the din. "This policy is dangerous," she declared. "Zero tolerance means one accusation could end a career. We cannot allow a single incident, caught on video or misinterpreted, to destroy livelihoods." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. A senior attendant spoke up. "I have been flying 20 years. Sometimes passengers lash out. Sometimes they record out of context. What if we are protecting ourselves and they call it bias? Are we supposed to lose our jobs overnight?" Karen nodded gravely. "We have to stand united. We cannot let Reed dictate policy without considering the people on the front lines. If this stands, we all stand vulnerable." Back in Chicago, Jonathan Reed was not blind to this backlash. His phone was flooded with messages from staff, executives, and allies warning of unrest. Still, he sat quietly in his office, a steaming cup of coffee untouched on the desk, eyes scanning the latest reports. Zoe Miller entered hesitantly, notebook in hand. "The unions are organizing. Jonathan, they are already calling this policy reckless. Some pilots are threatening a sick-out. The networks are picking it up." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his face calm but his mind racing. He knew this was inevitable. Change never arrived without resistance, but part of him wrestled with doubt. Was the pace too fast? Could the airline survive the turbulence of its own people rising against reform? He thought again of his daughter's voice asking if he was safe, and the answer reminded him why he could not bend now. That evening, Oceanic Air faced its first real test. On Flight 1125 from Los Angeles to New York, a passenger reported being asked intrusive questions about his accent and place of birth. The incident was caught on video, shared instantly online. Within hours, the flight attendant involved was suspended under the new protocol. The reaction was explosive. Union leaders decried it as a witch hunt. One video, no investigation, and a career destroyed. One spokesperson shouted at reporters, "This is chaos." Jonathan watched the footage himself. The words were clear, the prejudice undeniable. Yet he knew the unions had a point procedure mattered. If justice felt arbitrary, even when well-intentioned, it could collapse under its own weight. At midnight, he convened a video call with his closest advisors. Thomas Grant appeared exhausted. His tie loosened, his face drawn. Linda Perez was sharp as ever, her expression unyielding. Zoe sat quietly at her side, recording every word. Grant spoke first. The unions are in open revolt. If pilots join them, we could see grounded flights across the country. We cannot risk that. Jonathan, Perez cut in. The policy stands. Federal oversight requires it now. If Oceanic falters, we will step in directly.
The honor is all mine, Captain.
You must refine the process. Zero tolerance must not mean zero fairness. Jonathan folded his hands. So we strike a balance. Clear, immediate accountability, but with transparent review. No hidden committees, no delays. But every accused employee will face a fair hearing, not weeks later, but within 48 hours. Passengers must trust us. Employees must trust us. Both truths must stand. Perez nodded slowly. That is workable. It preserves integrity without chaos. Grant leaned back, relief flickering across his face. It may stop the bleeding, but Jonathan, understand this, you're walking a razor's edge. Too much rigidity and you'll break the
I've
workforce.
already put the preliminary
Too much
measures in
leniency
place.
and the public will crucify us. Jonathan said nothing, his eyes fixed on the screen, his mind wrestling with the weight of compromise. In his chest, a voice whispered, "Compromise is survival, but will survival dilute the truth?" The next morning, the compromise was announced. Oceanic Air unveiled the Rapid Review Council, a panel of trained investigators who would convene within 48 hours of any discrimination report. Transparent, public outcomes would be shared, ensuring no one was punished without due process. Yet no case would vanish into bureaucracy. The announcement sparked debate. Some employees felt reassured. Others saw it as too little, too late. The public, however, responded positively. Media outlets hailed it as a bold fusion of accountability and fairness. Stock prices stabilized, though volatility lingered. Still, the storm was far from over. 2 days later, Captain Robert Klein, the very pilot who had stood in that cabin on Flight 2941, gave a television interview. His face was somber, his voice steady, but his words carried a mix of remorse and resistance. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "I trusted my crew without verifying, and I allowed prejudice to influence my judgment. For that, I am deeply sorry. But I also say this reform cannot mean fear. Pilots and attendants cannot operate under constant threat of termination. If fear rules the skies, safety will suffer." The interview spread quickly. Some viewers praised his honesty. Others accused him of clinging to old excuses. For Jonathan, watching the broadcast alone in his office, the words stung. He could hear the sincerity in Klein's voice, the genuine regret, but he also heard the undertone, a plea for balance. That night, Jonathan walked the quiet streets near his hotel. Neon lights flickered in the drizzle, the city alive yet strangely distant. He thought of the path he had chosen, the storm he had unleashed. Inside him, two voices battled. One demanded unwavering conviction. The other whispered caution, warning that even the noblest reforms could collapse if carried out with iron fists. As he walked, a stranger approached, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. She stopped him gently. "Are you Mr.?" Reed Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "My son is a flight attendant." she said. "He called me today. He is scared. Not because of passengers, not because of safety, but because he thinks one wrong word could end everything. Please, sir, do not forget the good ones in your fight against the bad." Her words lingered long after she walked away. Jonathan returned to his hotel, stood by the window, and stared at the city below. For the first time since the incident, doubt settled heavily in his chest. Could he carry this reform without crushing those who had done nothing wrong in the morning? He faced the cameras again. Standing tall at a press conference, Jonathan addressed the nation. This is not about punishing the innocent. This is about ensuring dignity for every passenger while protecting fairness for every employee. There will be fear, yes, but fear will fade. What must remain is respect. Respect that flows in both directions. Respect that ensures every seat, every ticket, every passenger, and every worker matters. The words echoed across television screens, debated endlessly by pundits. Some called him a visionary, others called him naive. But everyone listened, and that, Jonathan knew, was the beginning of change. The United States Capitol rose into the gray Washington sky like a stone fortress. Television cameras lined the steps. Reporters braced against the February wind. Their microphones thrust forward as Jonathan Reed ascended slowly, his black coat swaying with each deliberate step. Behind him walked Zoe Miller, notebook in hand, her eyes wide at the magnitude of the day. Inside waited senators, representatives, and an entire nation eager to watch him defend what had become known as the Reed Protocol. In the hearing chamber, a hushed crowd filled every seat. Reporters hunched over laptops, their screens glowing like tiny lighthouses. Along one side sat union leaders, stiff with suspicion. On the other side, passengers who had once endured discrimination now leaned forward, hoping to see justice defended. At the center table, Jonathan placed his leather case down, his composure steady but inside, his heart hammered like a drum. He had faced corporate boards, hostile investors, even global competitors, but this felt different. This was not about balance sheets. This was about dignity itself. The committee chair, Senator Margaret Holloway, adjusted her glasses and spoke into the microphone. This hearing convenes to examine the Reed Protocol and its potential adoption as national policy. Mr. Reed, you stand at the center of a storm. Some call you a visionary, others call you reckless. Today, we will decide whether your ideas strengthen or weaken aviation in this country. Jonathan's voice was calm, resonant. Senator, I'm not here to be called either visionary or reckless. I'm here because tens of thousands of passengers have lived through indignities hidden in silence. What happened on Flight 2941 was not the first incident, only the first that could not be ignored. I ask that we no longer measure safety only in engines and wings, but also in respect. A murmur swept through the chamber. Senator Holloway nodded gravely but gestured toward another member. Senator Clayton Brooks, a man known for his ties to airline unions, leaned forward, his expression hard. Mr. Reed, your policy has already triggered chaos. Flight attendants fear they cannot speak without risking termination. Pilots worry that safety commands will be misinterpreted as bias. Are you not endangering aviation by creating fear in the very people meant to protect us? Jonathan inhaled slowly. Senator, fear is born when there is no clarity. The Reed Protocol is not meant to punish employees for safety measures, but to hold accountable those who allow prejudice to masquerade as procedure. If a safety concern is real, evidence will show it. If it is bias in disguise, that too will show. What destroys aviation is not accountability, but silence. Senator Brooks frowned but said no more. Cameras zoomed closer, catching every flicker of expression. Zoe scribbled furiously, sensing the moment's weight. Next came testimony from Captain Robert Klein, who had been summoned as a key witness. He walked slowly to the microphone, his uniform pressed, his face solemn. "I served as captain on Flight 2941," he began. "I failed to ask questions. I failed to see the truth. I trusted without verifying, and in that trust I betrayed the values I swore to uphold. For that, I accept full responsibility." His voice trembled slightly, but then grew firm. Yet, I must also say this reform must never strip us of judgment. Machines cannot fly planes, and protocols cannot replace human discernment. If we reduce crews to fear-driven actors, the skies themselves will grow more dangerous. His words landed heavily. The unions in the audience nodded in quiet agreement. Jonathan felt the weight of Klein's sincerity, the way guilt and principle clashed within him. For a moment, Jonathan wondered if the man was right, but then he recalled the silence of that cabin, the sting of words that declared someone like him did not belong, and he knew that discernment without accountability had already failed too many. When Jonathan's turn came again, he stood, towering with calm strength. He opened his case and laid out documents for the committee. Here are 407 documented incidents of discrimination reported within oceanic air alone in the past year. 70% involved passengers of color. Only a fraction were investigated, and even fewer resolved. These numbers are not abstract. They are mothers pulled from lines, fathers accused of theft, children reduced to suspects. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Screens flashed charts and graphs, undeniable evidence. Jonathan's voice deepened, steady as stone. If we claim to value safety, we must also value humanity. The Reed Protocol does not strip judgment. It demands that judgment be honest, accountable, and free from prejudice. If an employee acts rightly, they will be vindicated in hours. But if they act wrongly, the world will see it, and justice will be swift. Senator Holloway leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, do you ask this Congress to impose your protocol on every airline in America?" Jonathan paused, letting the silence stretch until every ear leaned closer. Then he spoke, each word deliberate. "I do not ask, I demand, because respect is not optional, dignity is not negotiable, and justice cannot wait." The chamber erupted in murmurs, reporters clattering on keyboards, cameras flashing wildly. From the union benches, Karen Lopez rose, requesting to speak. She was granted a microphone. Her voice was sharp. "Mr. Reed, your words sound noble, but you sit in a seat of power. What about the attendant who makes $30,000 a year, working double shifts, exhausted, overwhelmed, and says the wrong word
The honor
at the
is
wrong
all mine,
time?
Captain.
Do you destroy her life in the name of your ideals?" Jonathan looked directly at her. His voice softened, yet carried with piercing clarity. "No, Ms. Lopez, I do not destroy her life. Prejudice does. My protocol does not punish exhaustion, or error in service, or human imperfection. It punishes only when bias turns into action, when a person decides that skin color or accent determines value. That choice, not fatigue, not stress, is what destroys lives. And when that choice is made, it cannot be excused as a slip. It must be answered. The words
We need to ensure
silenced
all our
even his
assets are
critics.
secure before we land.
For a long
Understood.
moment, the only
I've already
sound
put
was
the
the scratch
preliminary
of
measures in
pens and the
place.
clicking of cameras. Zoe Miller felt her chest tighten. She had covered politics for 3 years, but she had never seen a room held in such rapt stillness by one man's conviction. Hours passed, witnesses testified, experts debated, senators grilled, but Jonathan never lost his calm. Inside, doubts still swirled. He remembered the woman who had begged him not to forget the good ones. He remembered the way Captain Klein had spoken of fear. Yet each time, he returned to the core of his truth. Silence had already cost too much. As the session drew to a close, Senator Holloway delivered her final words. "Mr. Reed, this committee will deliberate. But know this, you have shifted the ground beneath our feet. Whether the Reed protocol passes or fails, the skies will never look the same." When Jonathan stepped outside into the waiting storm of cameras, the crowd surged. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Reed, did you win today? Mr. Reed, are you forcing Congress's hand? Mr. Reed, what comes next?" Jonathan stopped on the steps, his figure framed by the Capitol's white columns. His eyes swept the crowd, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He raised his voice, low but resonant. "What comes next is not mine alone to decide. What comes next belongs to every passenger, every employee, every American who believes dignity must never be denied at 30,000 feet. Congress may deliberate, but the people have already spoken, and the world is watching." The roar of questions rose again, but his words had already spread like fire. Across the nation, television anchors repeated them. On social media, they surged into trending hashtags, and in living rooms and airports alike, people whispered that they had just witnessed not a hearing, but a turning point. Jonathan descended the steps, Zoe trailing close behind, her recorder still running. Inside him, exhaustion pressed heavy, but beneath it burned the steady flame of resolve. He knew the fight was far from over. Congress would debate, airlines would resist, unions would rally, yet he also knew something irreversible had happened. The skies were no longer silent. Justice had entered the cockpit. The winter sun hung low above Washington National Airport, casting long orange streaks across the tarmac. Jonathan Reed sat alone in a quiet lounge, the roar of departing jets muffled by thick glass. For the first time in weeks, there was silence. No hearings, no cameras, no live streams. Yet silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like the pause before another storm. He leaned back, staring at the runways. His reflection in the window looked older, lines etched deep by nights without rest. The burden of being both symbol and man weighed heavily. He thought of the day on Flight 2941 when he had chosen not to move, chosen to let prejudice expose itself. 12 minutes of stillness had turned into months of battle. Sometimes he asked himself whether it had been worth it. The answer always came the same. Yes. The door opened softly. Zoe Miller stepped in, clutching a stack of papers. "Mr. Reed," she said gently, "Congress is leaning toward passing the protocol. 3 senators flipped overnight. The headlines this morning call you the most influential passenger in aviation history." Jonathan offered a faint smile. History is fickle. "Zoe, today I am influential. Tomorrow I may be forgotten. What matters is whether a child boarding a flight next year feels safe." Zoe's eyes softened. "I think you know the answer. You already changed the skies. People are talking in airports everywhere. Travelers share your quotes like scripture. Seat 2A is now a phrase, a symbol. I don't think that will fade. Before Jonathan could respond, another figure entered. Captain Robert Klein, his uniform crisp, though his eyes carried the weight of shame. He hesitated before stepping closer. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice low, "I came to apologize once more, not as a witness, not before a committee, but as a man. I failed you. I failed my oath. I failed my own son." Jonathan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Captain, you already admitted your fault before the world. That takes courage. What matters now is what you do with the rest of your career. Will you let fear rule, or will you teach others that truth must come before convenience?" Klein's eyes glistened. "I will teach, if you will allow it. I want to be part of your reform. I want my son to grow up proud, not of my rank, but of my integrity." Jonathan extended his hand for a heartbeat. Klein hesitated, then grasped it firmly. The handshake carried no cameras, no applause, only two men acknowledging the weight of change. Moments later, the lounge television flashed breaking news. Congress had voted, by a narrow but decisive margin. The Reed Protocol passed as national aviation law. The screen filled with images of senators shaking hands, reporters scrambling to file stories, and passengers cheering in airports across the country. Zoe whispered in awe, "It happened. It's law now." Jonathan closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The sound of applause through the screen was distant, almost unreal. For months he had dreamed of this moment, yet now it felt less like victory and more like responsibility. The real work would begin tomorrow. Outside the lounge, crowds had gathered at the terminal windows, many holding signs, "Justice in the skies," "Seat 2A." Some carried photographs of loved ones who had endured humiliation. Others simply wanted to witness history. As Jonathan stepped out, the crowd erupted in cheers. Strangers reached out hands, some crying, some shouting his name. He felt the weight of their gratitude, but also the unspoken plea in their eyes. "Do not fail us now." Later that evening, he addressed the nation from the steps of the Capitol. Floodlights bathed the marble in white. Reporters filled the plaza, their microphones bristling like winter branches. Jonathan stood at the podium, his breath visible in the cold air. Behind him flew the American flag, snapping sharply in the wind. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "Months ago, I was told I did not belong in a seat I had paid for. I was told by action and by silence that dignity was negotiable, but dignity cannot be negotiated. Tonight, Congress has recognized that truth." The crowd cheered, the sound echoing against the stone. Jonathan raised his hand for quiet. "But let us be clear. A law is only paper. Change lives in the choices we make daily. Every attendant who greets a passenger, every captain who decides who belongs, every security officer who must act with both strength and fairness. Justice is not the burden of leaders alone, it is the burden of us all." He paused, letting the silence deepen. "From today forward, no passenger in this nation should fear being shamed, doubted, or cast aside because of skin, accent, or background. Seat 2A is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever been told they do not belong. Let it remind us that respect must always fly with us." Thunderous applause rose, rolling like a wave. Flashbulbs burst, cameras zoomed, In living rooms across the country, families wiped tears, strangers nodded to one another, and young children asked what it all meant. Parents answered softly, "It means you belong." As Jonathan stepped down, Zoe walked beside him, her recorder still running. "You know, they'll call this the Reed Revolution," she said. He shook his head gently. "Call it what they like. All I want is for one day, a young man in a suit, a mother with children, a teenager flying alone, to sit without question, without humiliation, and simply be seen as human." That night, news anchors across the world replayed his speech. Hashtags soared. Seat 2A reached 10 million mentions. Airlines scrambled to announce new training programs, new reporting hotlines, new commitments to dignity. Passengers felt a shift, subtle but real, as if the very air had changed. And yet, inside Jonathan's hotel room later, as he removed his cufflinks and set his watch on the nightstand, he felt only quiet resolve. He knew victories could be fleeting, reforms could be watered down, and critics would gather like storm clouds. But he also knew something irreversible had happened. Silence had been broken. Prejudice had been named. Justice had taken flight. He sat on the edge of the bed, thinking of Emily Dawson, the attendant whose prejudice had sparked it all. He thought of her tearful apology, of her young daughter who would one day ask what her mother had done. Perhaps that child would grow up in skies Jonathan had helped to clear. Perhaps Emily herself, through years of speaking to crews about her failure, would learn to carry dignity instead of bias. Jonathan closed his eyes. In his mind, he was back on Flight 2941, the cabin tense, the air heavy, the world holding its breath.
It's been an honor, sir.
He remembered the 12 minutes of silence.
The honor is
glint of
all
his
mine,
watch,
Captain.
the knowledge that patience could be power. He had not shouted. He had not fought with fists. He had simply waited for truth to reveal itself. And it had. Outside, the city lights of Washington shimmered. Somewhere a child boarded a flight, clutching a teddy bear. Somewhere a businessman stored his briefcase in the overhead bin. Somewhere a mother adjusted her daughter's seatbelt. And somewhere, in every small moment of travel, dignity was being tested again. But this time, the skies carried a new memory, the memory of a man who had sat still until the world could no longer ignore him. The man in seat 2A.
We need to ensure all our assets are secure
Jonathan
before
whispered
we land.
into the darkness.
Understood.
Not for cameras.
I've already put the
not for
preliminary
applause,
measures in place.
but for himself. Justice begins when silence ends. Then he lay back, letting sleep claim him at last. The story of the Seat 2A did not end on that plane, nor in the Capitol, nor in the news headlines. It lived on in every passenger who dared to demand respect, in every crew member who chose fairness over bias, in every law now written to protect dignity. It lived on in the quiet certainty that change, once set in motion, cannot be undone. And so, justice in the skies became not just a dream, but a reality born from 12 minutes of silence, a smile that unnerved prejudice, and a resolve that refused to bend. As the wheels touched down that day, the story of Jonathan Reed was no longer about one passenger, one crew, or one airline. It became a mirror reflecting the prejudice that lingers in quiet assumptions, the dangerous belief of who belongs and who does not. Jonathan never raised his voice. He never lashed out in anger. He waited. He let prejudice reveal itself. And when the truth emerged, he transformed humiliation into reform, pain into policy, and silence into justice. Seat 2A became more than a seat number. It became a symbol, a reminder that respect is not negotiable, that dignity is not for sale, and that even at 30,000 feet justice can and must be served. For the crew, this was a reckoning. For the passengers, it was a lesson. For the world, it was history unfolding in real time. And for us, it remains a call to never look away when dignity is denied. So tonight, as we leave Flight 2941 behind, carry this truth with you: change begins with the courage to stay seated when the world tells you to stand. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us because the next story may just change the way you see the world.